In this video, we're going to tie a Royal Coachman wet fly. This is a traditional wet fly pattern, very popular among trout fishermen, probably one of the most popular flies out there. We're going to start with an extra short shank, heavy wet fly hook. It is a Tiemco 3769, and I think here today we're tying it in a 12. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with the tail. The tail uses golden pheasant tippets. Actually a very difficult little material to work with, at least to get the tips nice and even. But the nice thing is the tips of the feathers are already even off the feather. So you don't have to even them up or anything. All you have to do is just be careful when trimming them from the feather. And there's a little trick. All you do is you just separate the portion just barely from the clump, pinch the tips so that they stay even. Then you can trim those from the stem. Don't worry if your trim is even or not, because the tips that we're pinching are still even. These ends do not matter. So then all you have to do is just transfer fingers and the tips of those feathers are nice and even. Then what we're going to do is we're just going to tie them in. Now this tail is generally tied fairly long on this fly, so at least the length of the shank of the hook. So I'll measure it out and cross the entire length of the shank of the hook. How I just kind of gauge it by is most of the feathers, you want this second black bar to be just at the very back end of the fly. And then we just simply tie them in right on top of the shank of the hook, wrapping all the way back to the bend. And you can trim out those butt ends. Then we'll take our thread back, almost to the back, where we are going to tie in our body material, which is 2 strands of natural peacock herl. So I just picked 2 of the fluffiest strands I can find out of the clump, and we're going to tie them in by the tips. So we're just going to tie those in there right at the back by those tips, just a couple of wraps to secure them. And I'll take my thread forward just to where the point of the hook touches my thread as it hangs there. Then I'm going to take that peacock herl and I'm going to wrap forward. Usually it only takes 3 to 4 wraps. You don't want to do too much more than that. At that point I can capture that peacock herl. Careful not to break it, and I'll wrap a few wraps forward. Now I take some red floss. I like to use uni single strand floss, not that 4-strand stuff. The single strand is nice and thin, so you can use it right off of the spool. Now floss can be kind of tricky to deal with. A lot of times the tips are frayed, hard to tie in. Just lick your fingers, give it a nice pull, and even a little twist, and it should even it all right up. So I tie the tip of that floss in, just right behind my peacock herl, and I'll wrap all the way back to that first piece of peacock herl that we tied in. Then I'll wrap forward. Now you want to make sure that you make this portion of the fly nice and smooth so you don't get a lumpy tag from your floss. Then I just take my floss, I pull it nice and taut and give it a couple wraps. Work my way forward. Then I can capture the floss. Now the tag on this fly, it's really personal preference as far as how large you want this tag to be. I like mine fairly small, kind of like what I just tied in. Some people like it almost the entire length of the body. It really just comes down to the tire and personal preference. So I'm just going to take my thread, I'm going to take it forward most of the way. I'm going to stop about a hook eye's length away from the eye. If you've never tied one before, you might want to leave a hook eye and a half length away from the eye. Leave a little bit more than you think you will probably need. And we can capture our peacock herl once we get to that section of the fly. Trim it as close as we can. Now we're ready for the hackle on this fly. I'm going to use some whiting hen. You want to make sure you use hen no matter what you use, but you can use either a saddle, which is what I'm going to use here today, or a cape. The saddle's feathers are just a little bit webbier than a cape feathers would be. A cape works just fine. Either way, I like to use the whiting, but there are India hen backs as well that you can use. The whiting are much longer, much higher quality, much finer. Now we want to make sure that we select a feather where the barbs reach back from the eye there and just touch past the point of the hook. So basically what I'm looking at is the length from here to there. So once I know that's long enough, I can simply stroke some of those fibers back, and I'll just strip a little bit of that fluff back out of the way so it doesn't get in the way of my fly when I'm tying it. And depending on how much hackle you want on your fly, if you want it really sparse, you can just use a little bit. If you like a little bit more hackle, you can add a little bit more. I usually kind of find the happy medium somewhere in the middle. It's usually about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of fibers is enough. I'm going to tie it in by the tip. That way, as we're tying the fly, the stem and fibers get thicker and thicker, making it easier to wrap as we wrap forward on the fly rather than thinner and thinner. Then before I make any wraps, I'm going to take all these fibers, I'm going to stroke them back onto the quill. That way it kind of kinks them, and it kind of preforms them to all lay back onto our fly. So that's the first thing I do, is I just stroke them all back, give them that nice kink. You can see how they all lay back nice and even on the fly automatically when I do that. Once I've done that, I can capture that stem. Oopsie, let go just a little bit too much. See if I can salvage it. I'm just going to unwrap. There we go. There's one little piece giving me a hard time. Just pluck them out of there. Alright, now I'm ready to capture it. If one little fiber gives you a hard time, you can just either use tweezers or scissors, and you can pluck them right out of there. Seems to never fail that you have a fiber that gives you a hard time. Then what we can do is just kind of spread those fibers to each side, and I'll kind of stroke them down, and I'll just do a couple wraps right up to it, and that'll help get those fibers to lay back just a little bit, kind of out of my way. Now we're ready for the wing, and for the wing we're going to use some Goose shoulder in white. Now you want to pick two feathers that are opposites of each other. And what I mean by that is you can see how they curve. Each of these stems will curve away from each other. That means you have a matched pair or a pair that is opposite. Now you'll trim from one side over here of one goose shoulder, and then from one side, where the gap is there, from one side of another goose shoulder. And when we do that, we'll get a clump of these feathers. So what you want to do is you want to trim out a nice generous clump. So I'll just get in here, I'll trim a nice little clump out. Just like so. And you can see with this feather, it swoops up or down, depending on how you hold it, and it also has a curve to it. You can see there it has a slight curve, just barely, so it's curving kind of that way. And if you get a feather from the opposite quill, they'll curve away from each other, or they can face into each other, depending on how you align the feathers. So now they're facing into each other. It looks like just one. You can tie them in any four of those combinations. It's up to the look that you're going for, the style that you're going for. A lot of people will tie them facing each other. A lot of people will tie them splaying away from each other. It really, truly is personal preference. Some people will say there's a right and a wrong way, but it really just depends on the look that you're going for and how you want the fly to act in the water. Now, if you've never tied one before, I would recommend tying them in splaying away from each other. That way you can kind of see which feather's which and how they're facing on the hook. And it's a little bit easier to manage if you tie them in that way. So we'll give that a try today. I'm going to try to find the nicest match pair that I can here out of my clumps. So now that I have my wings picked out, you can see that they splay away from each other. This is probably the hardest part of the fly, tying in the wings. You want to be very careful at this point. Give my bobbin a quick spin to bind up that thread. You want the wing to reach back just past that first black bar mark into the middle section of the tail. You want to pinch them together nice and tight. Then you want to do some loose wraps with your thread and then compress those fibers right on top of each other. That wing rolled on me just a little bit. Sometimes you can kind of lift it up and twist it to manipulate it into place. Then you can trim. What I'm going to actually do here is I'm just going to do a quick whip finish underneath here just to kind of keep that thread where it's at. You can also use a half hitch just so I can get in here and trim this head nice and close. To be very careful at this point. And I can carefully just take my thread and build up a little bit of a head. Now traditionally wet flies do have a little bit a larger head than like a dry fly would, and you will want to take some nice glossy lacquer and lacquer up a nice clean shiny head. That is traditionally what wet flies have. And don't get frustrated with this fly. Those wings can be one of the most tricky things to deal with. I know that I've had to tie a few to kind of get the hang of it, and no wet fly that you tie with these wings is going to be perfect. I have yet to tie a perfect one. I'm sure there are some fly tiers out there who have tied many of them that can tie the perfect one, but that is not me, and that certainly will probably not be you the first time you tie them, just because it is such a tricky material to deal with. So don't get frustrated. Give it a few shots, really stick with it, and work on those wings and try a few different pieces of Goose. You can see here, you know, I've tried a few times on a few flies, and if these fibers are fighting you and not cooperating with you, instead of trying to make it work, just start over and try another batch. And that is the Royal Coachman Wet. You can find all the materials for this fly on our website, intheriffle.com.